as book learning, as rote learning, as something that we learn by repeating it out loud. Most things are excellent. Most things are come to by means of investigation, and that would be the child's version of grammar. And then upon investigation, consideration, that would be the child's version of logic. And then of saying our discoveries out loud, that would be the child's version of rhetoric. What child doesn't want to tell you all about their latest discovery? And that this, again, we're always coming back to the need to say this out loud, to express this to somebody else, that it's as if knowledge on its own is valueless unless it's imparted to somebody else. And there's also a refinement that goes on there. I've always called it my bullshit filter, and that I find that if I've just thought about a subject and never spoken about it to somebody else, that I can often be quite confused in my thinking, quite I suppose fuddled in my thinking. Fuzzy thinking is very easy when one only has oneself to consider something. But as soon as one begins to discuss that very same thinking with another person, suddenly your bullshit filter cuts in. And if you start to say something out loud that is patently ridiculous, regardless of how well thought out and clearly you can describe it, when you go to describe it and it's bollocks, you know that it's bollocks. You can feel it that it's bollocks. And if you're not a complete egotist, hopefully you'll stop saying what it was that you were about to say, consider the fact that you now know it to be bollocks, and consider what that realisation reflects on your original thinking. And then again, we have the trivium. We apply grammar by refining the concept that was originally bollocks. We apply logic to that and realise where it was that we were going wrong, because we know that it's bollocks, therefore we must know what the opposite of bollocks is, and we end up with a rational idea. I suppose I find myself repeating phrases. I suppose it almost becomes like a catchphrase, or maybe it's just that's the tangent of the ideas that I'm pursuing at the time. But I keep finding the Sherlock Holmes quote of when you have reduced a thing where you have taken away everything that is impossible, what you are left with, regardless of how improbable, must be the truth. And this is a very kind of wordy way of describing the trivium, that if we hear something, consider it, and then go to say it out loud, then hopefully everybody's bullshit filter will cut in, and without ever needing to find any more external data points, simply by applying our own internal innate knowledge and our own internal intellect, that there is nothing about the universe, about the observed universe, that we can't define from within. Certainly input from without may speed the process, but certainly Phil was alluding to the Akashic record there of a overarching intellect that we do actually have access to through meditation, the dream state, certain Gnostic practices, and possibly just simply the sense of intuition that may well be what we are feeling. The data points, the reference with which we are referring when we have something that we describe as intuition, the sense of knowing what's right without actually knowing how we know it, I suppose would be an adequate description of intuition. We certainly all feel it on a daily basis, and certainly I have found, and I have heard other people say this as well, that when you learn to trust your intuition and begin to prevent the intercedence of the rational mind into the intuitive state, that your intuition will often prove more right than any idea or thought that you may have had on the same subject. So, and again, it's very difficult for somebody, especially somebody as mechanistic as me, to begin to rely for judgment on something that I know to be entirely feeling based. But I suppose I've come to trust them from my intuitive state, which I've held since a youngster, without any real evidence or reference to any external source. I knew that it was my mind that conjured the intervention of the police when I was driving late at night. I knew that it was my mind that created the industrial accidents, say, that I would be victim to. I knew intuitively that the direction of focus of the mind is the direction of focus of observed reality. And so without ever having anything other than, like I say, intuited beliefs to base that perspective on, I found that I would tend to live by that. I would project my reality down an open road. Funnily enough, I was talking to Vin about this only the other night, and he describes using an almost identical process whereby I would project my desire for an uninterrupted drive out in front of the car in front of me as I was driving, and to hold this in a conscious way for the whole time I was driving. And I would often find that on long journeys it would be at the very moment where my concentration would wane that, lo and behold, there would be a policeman by the side of the road, the very thing that I was trying to avoid either thinking about or seeing. So I suppose repeated observed reality was essentially what left me trusting in my intuition beyond that which I had reference for. So again, we enter into the concept of gnosis, of knowing without having any external systematic understanding of that which you're experiencing, but repeatedly having evidence that that which you're experiencing is in fact reality. So there's something to think on. My young associate here in the room here is just giving me my next topic. In fact, I was alluded to feeling myself to be enumerate, having been presented with some of the stuff that I've needed for the research. Well, essentially it's a matter of being... I've over many years been presented with incredible claims which are supported almost entirely by mathematical proofs, and I have ended up having to decide whether or not I believe the claims that are put to me, not on the logic of deduction and the understanding of the mathematics of the proofs, but more on an emotional level, on whether or not do I believe that this guy's genuine enough to even consider this stuff, because when I look at the maths it looks like hieroglyphics. And this has been coming up more and more frequently for me. There's Monk, what's his first name? I can't remember, but essentially there's a bunch of YouTubes going around at the moment with somebody that has taken the grid reference latitudes and longitudes of all of the sacred sites around the world, and has plotted them on a adjusted grid reference with the GMT line, the zero longitude, being taken at the Great Pyramid of Giza rather than through Greenwich. And having done this, he then applies mathematical functions to the grid references, and comes up with something that he describes as a grid metric, which he can then plot on a grid matrix. and by using this kind of number code, he's been able to essentially decode the messages left in pretty much every sacred site that we know of. And some pretty extraordinary ones as well, because one of the grid references happened to point to Cydonia on Mars, which was quite surprising. And unfortunately I'm left in the position of being able to follow his reasoning and being able to follow a lot of his maths, and certainly enough of it to be able to understand the language of the sites themselves. So using his system, I would be able to interpret, say, a pyramid or a stone circle or an earthwork with some confidence and some deduction being applied through mathematical modelling. But what he's actually suggesting is that all of these stone sites have encoded within them a grid reference and a relation to every other stone monument or ancient site, and that's really quite an extraordinary claim, which, like I say, has left me feeling largely innumerate, and this left me thinking very much on the substance of language. Funnily enough, one of my researchers came up with the language, the English, the modern English, as actually being a creation of the Catholic Church, being issued as a dictate through the likes of the works of Shakespeare and Chaucer. So essentially, we have the English language being formulated through the alchemistic works of writers who may or may not have been a single author, or even the person that's being claimed for the work. So there's certainly something very suspect at the base of the English language. When you look into the numerology of modern English, the numerology is just too precise for coincidence. If the English language had formed the way that we're told that it had formed, out of Latin, Greek, French, etc., etc., and through the moulding of effectively slang use of those terms, and that then being formulatised, I suppose, formularised by the printing press, when we then get large-scale reproductions of a single work, so words start to become agreed and fixed. But if that was the true mechanism, then we would see a very chaotic numerological interrelation between the letters and their numerological values, and in fact that's not what we see. If you look into the numerology attached to modern English, you'll find that it doesn't fit, where that it does fit, where Old English it didn't fit, and didn't fit nearly at all, although there are some instances where it comes up with some quite interesting significances. But the only place where numerology fits to a language quite so neatly is to Hebrew, which is the essentially where the Chaldean numerology, when applied to the alphabet, probably first stemmed from the Jewish sect of the Jewish Chaldean sect, which is like an occult craft of the Jewish religion, Kabbalistic, I suppose it would be described. Where was I going? Yes, so of course number. And this is the thing that we keep coming back to, is that we use language, we use words to describe observed reality, but quite often those words fail us and we have to resort to mathematics. Well, it's very unfortunate that our education in mathematics is so poor that we aren't even taught about concepts like phi. Most people have heard of pi.